everyone, and welcome to the Narrative Design Workshop. Woo! Yeah. All right. So we're just going to start off with a general overview of what narrative design is. It's basically just the design of a game related to the storytelling elements. And it's not necessarily all the actual writing that you will do for the game specifically, but the main emphasis is more on how this game tells its story. What are the components? If there is dialogue, how are you using that dialogue and what structures are you putting into your game to tell your narrative or show your story world. And they don't have to be told through text or dialogue. You can more subtly create a narrative through things such as environmental storytelling, which is crafting a world slash presenting a narrative indirectly through the surroundings as opposed to just telling a story through dialogue or text. And one example of this is Little Nightmares. There's not really any dialogue in the game. There's no like notes that you find or anything. You just come to understand this story through the different scenes that you will find in the surroundings and the different things that your character goes through and what other characters do in the game. All right, so just a general overview of things you might do for how you want to tell the story. We have some very basic lists of some different things you might do we already talked about environmental storytelling. You also might use different things such as cutscenes. You might do quote unquote found text, which is where like you might find notes with written text on them. Or you might find audio logs where you listen to something about things that are going on or video logs, also just in general dialogue between characters. And it's also good to think about your world building in general. And also you might want to think about hard and soft world building, where hard world building is where you have very clear-cut rules as to the things that are going on in your world and in your universe. And soft world building means it's more fluid. You have very loose rules and a lot more suspension of disbelief from your player and audience. And also, you might want to consider what elements are diegetic versus just there for the player to experience outside of the story. So, something that is diegetic is something that is in the story world that your characters actually experience. One thing that might be diegetic is if you have a radio in a room that your player is in and you can see that there's music coming from the radio and you're hearing the music, your player character in the story is also probably hearing that music as well. And that's something diegetic. And maybe some things like boss music might not be diegetic. It might just be purely for you playing the game. And also, for another example, the health system in Dead Space is diegetic. It is something that is in the game world. As you can see, the health is on the back of the player character, and it is something that is tied to the technology of the game that you are playing. And but there's also another thing to think about. Is some things you don't want everything to be diegetic depending on what type of game you are crafting. There are some things that you're going to want to have for ease of playing the game for the players in terms of UI and just make it easier for the players to play the game and just get through different things.
Yeah, it's easy to have a lot of fun with this, and I think it is good to be creative with the world building, even going into character and plot a bit there. But if it gets too complicated and too innovative, it can get a little confusing and start to feel forced or unnecessary.
Yeah.
But it's still fun.
Yeah.
The main idea is that every game is its own sort of cohesive world with varying complexity, and every character in it has a motivation for being there, and everything spawns sort of out of that idea.
One example of the forced idea of what Mariana was talking about might be Red Dead Redemption 2 of looking through the catalog in the different stores. So it's really cool to see that like, oh, hey, I'm actually flipping through this catalog of things that seems very real to this world and to this time period. But also at the same time, it might be very frustrating to try to figure out exactly, okay, what am I actually buying? What is this going to do for my character? And how is this going to help me type of thing.
You can kind of do a mix, I think, of how much it looks like it's really in the world versus what's just there for the player to understand. For example, I think the game Epic Mickey 2 is not great at everything storytelling wise, but one thing that I think it does well is the shop system as compared to what you were saying. It is a bit catalogy as you can like see each thing, how many e-tickets it's worth, in other words, like the currency, and it's always got a background that's related to the store, but if you hover over each item, it will tell you what it does exactly, which is pretty helpful, but it doesn't completely break the world either. Because like it'll say, yeah, increases health, which Mickey Mouse, the main character, might not know that this is increasing his health. That would be a little bit silly. But it still feels like it's not completely breaking from the world because you've got all the shop going on, you've got like music that's a little bit distorted, like it's playing over a loudspeaker, things like that.
Okay, so before jump into the meat of something called choice poetics, we did want to talk a little bit about that. In this workshop, we will be specifically talking about video games, and there are other forms of digital media involving narratives and some other types of narrative design, though not quite in the same way. And we just wanted to iterate that we're definitely talking about the choice based video game usage of narrative design. And kind of an umbrella term is interactive narratives, which are narratives that let the audience interact with them, but not significantly impact the narrative in that world. And one example is the visual novel, a fantastic piece of media. It's a great storytelling device, but this is not quite a game. There are graphical representations of what is going on, but the player does not have many, if any, choices. And so and it can get kind of blurry of what do people consider a game and what do people not consider a game. And I do think sometimes games are slapped on the label as visual novels, sometimes just purely for search engine wise to get the most like clicks and views when you slap on a bunch of labels. But I do think there are a bunch of games that are slapped on as a visual novel that aren't technically visual novels, that are more video games. But that was just one thing I wanted to bring up before we dive into some more stuff. And some other examples are interactive storytelling, interactive fiction, electronic literature, and interactive drama, which is really interesting, of interacting with different actors and how some people do stuff with that. So
It's talking of like a stage play there.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
with the audience feedback.
One example would be like if you're in a series of rooms and you're able to walk around and maybe see different actors acting out different things in the different rooms, and you're able to just go around freely and see what is going on in your own way and own order.
Yeah, so it's not quite a game, but it is very interactive and fun,
Yeah,
like a game is.
yeah.
Take CSC 281.
Mhm. Yeah. So choice poetics, the basics. So there are implicit choices that are pretty, you make them pretty fast, and these are choices that you may not even consider to be a choice. And one example is like making Mario run to the right. You're not sitting there thinking, okay, I need to make a choice. Do I run left or right or do I jump? Let me think about it. No, you don't really do that. You just move the controller and you just make Mario jump and run and do all these different things. And these are more continuous and right after the other, and so they're just more implicit choices. And the other side of this is that there are explicit choices, which um, are more of the stop and think, okay, I am sitting here and I know I'm making a choice and I need to choose something here. And so one example is making a choice of how you want a character to verbally respond in a conversation in Until Dawn. We also have an image up of the hostage section of Detroit Become Human, which involves a lot of explicit choices all throughout that game that impact the narrative and give you different scenes and different endings. And also, in general, there is an overall kind of choice structure that you'll get. So you'll usually have the framing and then the options and then the outcomes. So framing is just basically setting up the choice, what's at stake, what's going on, just a kind of like background of that choice. Options, just the things a player can choose. And then outcomes, basically the result of those choices. So it's pretty self-explanatory. And the choice structure here is mainly for the discrete explicit choices.
That's one of the great things about video game storytelling as opposed to like a book or movie or anything like that is the player gets to really shape how the story is being told. And that does kind of come in and make the design more confusing, especially if you want different alternate endings. But it's a lot of fun to think about that you're just kind of setting up the theme, the plot, the world, the character. But depending on how many like explicit to implicit choices you're going to be allowing the player to make, if there's a lot of explicit choices, you kind of just have to set it up really loosely and let the player run wild with it and let it be their own story too. Whereas if it's implicit choices, you're probably going to have a lot more control over how the story goes. To use another Mario example, like Super Mario Odyssey, you don't get to choose much of the story at all. Like, you get to choose a couple of locations to go to. As far as I recall, there's no dialogue choices or anything like that. Or if there is, it's like okay and yes or something to that effect. But whereas a story with a lot of explicit choices, I'll pull back in Epic Mickey because the first one is actually a lot of really fun storytelling. The second one, not such a good game. But going with that, you do have a lot more options of am I going to befriend characters? Am I going to destroy them? What am I going to do with the bosses? And you have very different endings depending on how you play that game out. So I think it's a lot of fun to think about how do you want to let the player shape the story. That's again why it's narrative design and not just writing. You're designing a narrative, but you're not writing a narrative as much.
All right. So now from there, we move on to something within choice poetics. We have choice idioms. So here is I've had a few slides with just listing out some of these different choice idioms that you can think about and different types of choices you may want to use in your games. So I'll just run through these pretty quickly. So there's a dead end option, a choice that basically terminates a narrative. This can add challenge to your game. You can make it so that there's more replayability, so that the players have to start over or start from a certain point if they reach this dead end. There's also a false choice, which is a choice where it doesn't matter what the player picks, the same outcome is reached. So sometimes you can see this pretty clearly in dialogue options, where you choose a dialogue option and your player character says something, and then you can tell the NPC is not really responding to that thing you specifically said. They're just saying this generic thing, and they probably would have said that same thing no matter what you said. That's a false choice. And they can add a little flavor to the game and a little identity of the person playing the game, putting their own choices into the game where the developers don't really want a specific outcome to happen. But also you might want to be careful about not using too many of these because it can really reduce player agency, and sometimes that gets really frustrating. And then there's also blind choice, which is a choice that is made where the player does not know what the outcome will be. And then a dilemma, which is a choice where there are significant trade-offs between options. So if one choice is objectively worse than the other, then that's not considered a dilemma, and it must be an informed choice, because then otherwise that would just be a blind choice and not a dilemma.
With these first three, you do not have to tell necessarily the player what's going to happen with these. You can make a false choice, and well, once again, you should kind of avoid those when possible, when you can. You do not have to tell your player that it's a false choice. They can be fully believing that they're making something that like fundamentally changes the narrative, because that can be part of the immersion. That can be with any of these. But with a dilemma, the player actually has to know what's going on, and it actually has to be a hard choice. It's got to be one of those where you're like, have the options open and you're like staring at your screen, and it's like, if I do this, if I can't pick both of these options at the same time, I'll die, etc.
Dilemma, very hard choices to make usually.
Yeah, like the one up here, clearly a dilemma.
Okay.
Oh, it died.
It survived. Yay! It's getting a little tired of choice idioms.
Yeah,
So
it was a false choice.
yes. It did not let me continue. All right, so there's also flavor choices, which have small changes, that changes a small aspect of the game that generally stays throughout the game. A big example of this is character customization. And there's also delay choices that are delayed effect, and they don't produce a result until later. One example might be playing like an Until Dawn sort of game, and you make a small choice in the beginning, and then later it causes one of your characters to be killed off a few hours into the game. That would be an example of a delayed effect choice. And then there's also puzzle choices, which you're making an explicit choice when solving a puzzle, though this is more of on the game mechanics side, but it can be also considered here as well. There's also an unchoice, having only a single way the player can progress, for example, hitting continue. And again, you really don't want this to be the only choices you have, because it's not really a choice, but it is still something the player can hit continue with, or there's lots of other different ways that you can just click an arrow or something like that. Yeah, and then you also have the exploratory choice, which is basically just like it sounds, having the player explore the world. It's a reversible choice in which the player is free to go back. Like maybe you say, oh, inspect this cabinet, and they look in the cabinet, they're like, okay, there are these items. Okay, let me back up, and then that's it. There's no punishment for that. It's not a dead-end option where, oh, I opened the cabinet and I died because a hand came out and killed me. No, you're just able to look at the cabinet and then say, okay, I'll go back now. Just able to explore the world by choosing that thing.
It can be great for world building and plot and just game in general.
Mhm.
Very fun multitasking here. Yeah, so now I wanted to show off an example of a game that specifically Evelyn and I worked on. Lainey, you're also free to talk about this as much as you want, even though I know you weren't technically involved in the
I feel
development.
like we should
Good.
trade places.
Only if you want.
Don't do it.
All right.
Shine.
Yeah, so this is a game that's told in 3 phases, but the basic plot of the game is sure, your victim was doing something evil, but there's no way around it. You just committed a murder. Sorry. Now you must tamper with evidence to cover your trail. Navigate through each of the cover up phases and finally face off against the detective trailing you. Make the right choices, and you'll get away with murder. So yeah, you progress through 3 different phases. The first one being a sort of puzzle phase where you have to choose the correct options. Second phase is a platformer, and the third phase is a bunch of dialogue options. This being a screenshot taken from the third phase. Lovely artwork there. But yeah, so with the dialogue options, I was the one who was mostly writing that. Evelyn did a lot with the beginning of the story, but then the entire team was helping out with the dialogue options and all of the storytelling as well. So really, it is a team effort. Whenever there's narrative design involved, you have to work with the programmers, the artists, everybody. But I was writing the dialogue options. So if you'd like to move to the next slide, we'll actually see the document that I was creating to use. I'm sorry. Yeah, computer's a little funny right now. Yeah, this was what the document looked like that I was using to create dialogue options. So we've got different color coding depending on, is this just something that the detective is saying? Is this the correct option for the player, the wrong option for the player? We've got some comments that are just written in yellow. For example, branching paths, we've got 6.1, 0.2, and 0.3 depending on what the player chooses before it moves on to the next stage. But yeah, so you can see the player's given lots of different choices about what to say. And now I can go ahead and put a little bit of knowledge to use. And I wanted to ask what types of choice poetics do you see here, and what kind of impact do you think that they have on the game and the narrative design? That's correct. Yes. Woo! We have a winner.
Yeah!
You get a trophy tonight. Remind me later.
Let's go.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can see you've got here the blue text means that you're under arrest, and that is a game over for this game. But you can also see there's a what was this type of choice called? I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But the type where you've got 2 options that are the same false choice, I believe. The false choice here between and To be honest, that was done for humor purposes as to whether you would prefer, again, identity building, whether you'd prefer your character, the way you're telling the story, to be the type of person who says or the type of person who says when you're under pressure. You do get the same result either way. So it is a false choice, and it is pretty obvious between the 2 choices that they're very similar, and at this point you are going to get the game over. But it is kind of fun sometimes to play with false choice, even though we tried not to do that too often. It was more like just another way to give the player choice after the detective says something rather than immediately being placed under arrest. So it's also kind of a sign to the player that this is the part where you messed up, And if you want to replay the game, choose something different this time when you're talking. Any other choice poetics that anyone wants to point out on these? And I know it might be a little bit hard to read. I'm sorry. I tried to make it as big as possible for this slide. Go ahead.
That first choice, where you said, "Sure, I understand," or maybe I should ask you a few questions. Is that a false choice as well?
No, I would say it's actually not false choice. The difference being that one of these options is correct and one of them is incorrect. Because
Does it end the narrative or just change the route?
it doesn't end the narrative, it does change the route because I probably should have explained this earlier. What's going on in this phase, you do have a suspiciousness meter at the top. So if you get a question wrong, it doesn't always immediately lead you to a game over. With this type of question where it doesn't end and you're under arrest, it'll just add another bar into your suspicion meter. So after you've had 5 suspicious answers, that will also give you a game over. So in this case, if you choose the green answer, you're good. It doesn't increase your suspicion. It just moves you to the next question. But if you choose the red answer, it increases a bar on the suspicion meter because you're being a little snarky, which is fun, and that's why the option is there so that you can have some fun. But it is unfortunately suspicious and does not reflect well on you. It might be a blind choice a bit because you can't necessarily tell like, oh, I'm a snarky person. I'm going to pick the snarky answer just for fun. But you do have to know the context and the plot of the game that you're trying to be getting away with murder. So being snarky is probably not the best option here as you're trying to avoid that. Go ahead, Luke.
2 questions. Question number 1 is that could you give me an example of a flavor choice? And secondly, in terms of choice poetic philosophy, what's the distinction between a flavor choice and something like an unchoice or a blind choice?
Sure.
So,
Sorry, you can start.
So a flavor choice is something that typically lasts for a very long time or like throughout the game. An unchoice is usually something that is just very one and done, like basically like okay, let me just get to the next thing that the game is leading me to. So, but for like a flavor choice, for example, let's say that you're there and they ask you, oh, put in like your favorite food, and let's say you put in sushi, right? And then every once in a while, maybe it just shows up, it pops up sushi every once in a while, just in specific points in the game. That's more of like a flavor choice of you saying, okay, I'm going to put in sushi. Or like maybe saying, oh, okay, I've got this outfit. Let me choose one of these outfits. And then that's like an outfit that your character will have for the rest of the game. That's a flavor choice. That may not necessarily affect anything else in the game or the narrative, but it's adding more flavor to your game and to your experience. Whereas that wouldn't be considered an unchoice because it continues for a lot longer and it affects your experience more. That makes sense.
I don't know that there's actually any flavor choices, at least on these 2 pages of the game. And thinking through it, I don't remember there being any actually in the game because there's not really any that have a long term effect per se. However, I think one could make the argument that this kind of question is kind of a flavor choice. You're setting the tone for is my character more, nice and just trying to get through this, or is she more snarky? Because if you do choose the snarky answer, since it does increase the suspicion meter, you might be able to argue that this is a flavor choice in setting up yourself for failure. But it doesn't necessarily impact and come back around later. There are delayed choices. For example, this one, you can see in the note, this does not make the player gain suspicion because the alibi is not checked until the end of the lying phase. That's why all 3 of these answers are correct, no matter what the player had chosen in the platforming stage, where the player chose to run away to. But it does come up again later in the game. And if you picked the wrong one here, you will get arrested and you will get a game over. So technically, you have to choose the right one, but it does not immediately gain you any suspicion. Hopefully that sort of answers your question. I wish there was an example of flavor choice here and I would show that, but I don't think there is one in this game, unfortunately.
Would you mind if I ask further questions?
Sure, go ahead.
So, firstly, is an unchoice mainly used as a form of rhetoric?
It can be. I would say usually it's just a function of, okay, I don't want all dialogue on the screen at once. Let me just click continue to keep going. I would say it's more of like breaking up the story in terms of pacing it and in terms of just, okay, how much do I want to show to the player at once? Because it's kind of scary if you like open up a game and you're like, let me look at this. Oh, there's a whole essay I have
Whole
to read.
novel.
Yeah, with
Instead,
terms and conditions.
Yeah,
instead of reading this whole terms and conditions, let me just go through and read like a few sentences at a time and then click continue and then go on to the next thing. So it's not like polluting your visual, like your screen. Yeah, and polluting your brain with way too much stimuli at once and also pacing it. But I do think there could be an argument that unchoices can be used as rhetoric. It can make, I think that there are some games that kind of break the rules of what you quote unquote should do and maybe use all unchoices to make a specific statement.
It's all immersion based.
Exactly. Because I was thinking to both of y'all's points now. If you think of Super Mario Galaxy 2, there's a few choices of dialogue in the game, but I think all except maybe one of them are unchoices. It's just like okay and yeah, choices like that are really just there to move it forward. But they do give you, like you're saying, a little bit of a sense of immersion. It breaks up the text and it also lets the player feel like they have a little more control over what's happening. So it's kind of fun. It's not super fun because there's not like any snarky answers or anything that I recall, but it does add a little bit more interactivity during what would otherwise just be long cutscenes with a lot of dialogue from the mentor character.
And the second question I had is a further one with flavor choices. I want to hear your perspective on this. Of course, flavor choices take an aspect of whether it be the narrative, the character, and makes it variable. And sometimes that can lead to different effects. For example, like if you're taking like costumes and like fighting games, like Tekken for instance, there's so
Had a feeling
much
where this is going.
customization available, some of which makes no sense, right? Of course, that's just fucking Tekken. But like, for other flavor choices, how do you make the distinction between allowing this to be variable and when you realize it detracts from the immersion or the integrity of your narrative?
I think that's very dependent on the story you want to tell. And I think maybe if you're telling a very specific story that you want to get across about this specific character, maybe you might not want to use those flavor choices because you're like, oh, this specific character, that's not in their characterization. They would not choose those things. They would choose this and this, and I know what they'll have for breakfast. I know what they did on like their worst day of their life. I know what this is and what that is. So you may not want to use those flavor choices for those certain type of narratives that you want to get something very specific across or you want specific things to be shown. But in games where maybe that's not as much of the focus, then maybe you will have some more of those flavor choices thrown in. It's just dependent on what the developers want to get across with that story and what they're doing with those characters.
Are you playing you? Are you playing a completely different person? Or are you playing a you influenced person? Or kind of how you think you can level it out. Like how distinct is the character you're writing? And that is all just dependent on what story you want to tell through that distinction.
Exactly. I'm personally a huge advocate of flavor choices simply because they give more control to the player. Because if you think about it, what makes a game fun? You've got control over it. Whenever a game does not give you control, that's when it's not fun, or when you feel like you don't have control. For example, glitches. They make you feel like you suddenly don't have any control over the game anymore, and that's not fun. And even more than that, when, for example, you're trying to solve a puzzle and it's not really explained to you what you're supposed to be doing, or it tries to hold you by the hand too much, you feel like you don't have control over what's happening and you're just failing over and over, and it feels like you can't control it. That's one of the fun things with flavor choices is that they give the player more control, which means more interactivity and more of a game aspect. So you don't have to use them, but personally, I really like them. Yeah.
We really do need to move on.
Okay, sure.
We gotta go.
Oh, we went really far.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So procedural rhetoric. So getting into this, put simply in general, rhetoric in general is just a purposeful act of communication addressing an audience. It's actually pretty simple, and procedural rhetoric in video games is basically the practice of using processes persuasively. So, for example, like using the mechanics and the dynamics that arise from those mechanics, if we're talking about the MDA framework, to communicate something to the player. And I've got some examples listed down here. There's some that really use a lot of procedural rhetoric. There's Paper Please, Evelyn, and Undertale. And Evelyn is a game that was written by Pippin Marr, and I played this for 281, and it caught my eye because it was my name, but then it was also about writing, which was very interesting. So basically, you play as this character, and you have choices of during the you're supposed to be writing during the day, but you also have other choices to lie down on the mat or like call someone on the phone or look at your bookshelf or look out the window, or you can sit down and type. And when you type, in order to have the words appear on the screen, you have to actually press all the buttons on your keyboard. You can press random buttons or whatever you want, but basically you have to be pressing a button in order to let those characters go on the screen. And it will tell you at the end of the day how much you have typed each day. And eventually you will type out this whole story. But the procedural rhetoric basically seemed to be saying that no matter what you're doing, as long as you just keep at it or like keep writing, you will have something finished. You will eventually have a finished project if you don't just lay on the mat on the floor all the time, or if you don't just stare out the window every day. But if you actually, but if you actually get to work and do that. And and I'll also share this PowerPoint at the end through like a downloadable PowerPoint version on Discord, so you'll be able to also go to the website and play the game because it's for free. It's just online, and there's also other things about it that are more deep, but I do think we need to keep rolling. So, okay, no spoilers, I promise, but I wanted to mention another procedural rhetoric example. So, in The Last of Us Part 2, you can play the guitar. I won't say anything else because I don't want to give any spoilers whatsoever, but it is important. Pay attention to playing the guitar and pay attention throughout the whole game. And I have ideas about it, but I don't want to say anything because I don't want to spoil this awesome game for anyone. So pay attention to the guitar. Okay. Oh, goodness. Oh, goodness. Okay. All right. Now we're on to the Twine workshop portion. So basically, Twine is just an open source application that can be used to create narrative-based games or interactive stories. The link is right there. It's basically twinery.org. And it can do lots of different things. We're not gonna go into how to like put in like music or images into it. We're gonna focus on like the basics of setting up the different stories and different branching pathways and some variables that you can do. So most basically, you can make a new page of text for the player that can be sent to. So you can just type out on a page on Twine and just type out whatever you want, and that is what will be displayed to your player. And underneath that or above it or wherever you want, you can put in double brackets, and inside the brackets you can put in an option for the player, and that will show up to the player in terms of text, and the player can click on that and it'll send them to the next page. And then there's also stop being difficult. Okay, there's also a way that you can set it so that you can make the player go to a specific page, but if you want the player to see something else, you can show the player different text, and basically the option word again is what the player will see, but then after the little arrow, you will have the location or like the page that the player is actually sent to in your whole Twine pages.
It's very page-based where you're putting different parts of the story, like different scenes, so to speak, on different pages.
Mm-hmm.
It's as easy as these games can get to make.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's fantastic.
Yep. And then you can set has whatever you want to name a variable to be true, and it just sets a variable to be true, and you can also set a variable to false as well. And then finally, you can have if statements. So you can have if has something is true, you can do a thing and have something else. So for example, if you only want like an option to show up to a player if they have gotten this certain thing through going through a
You've got
pathway,
the magic amulet.
you would want to use an if statement and then put that option in the do a thing brackets.
Now you can cast
If-
fireball.
Yep, if that something is true. So I will now show Twine on my laptop. It's basically free. You can either get it you can get it you can just use a browser version or you can also download it as well. But yeah, I'm just going to go and create a new story. I'm going to call it workshop story. No, not the failed Patrick. Yeah.
It was beautiful. There you go.
Work in progress, Patrick. Yes. So basically, this is what you're presented with, a blank slate. Before doing anything, also, if you want, you can go over and you can go to story formats, and there are different story formats here you can choose. I like just the general format using that for now, but there are different ones that will have different features and different looks and easier looks to get from the beginning, depending on what type of story and narrative you want to tell. But so I'm gonna go back, and so here I have this untitled passage. I can double click it, and it pops up this text, and you can basically type in it. So I'm gonna say make a choice, and so this is what will show up. Yes, this is what will show up on the page. And if you want to make another passage, you can just put in those brackets. I want this choice. And boom, it automatically makes another page for you. It's pretty magical. Yeah.
Whoa.
You can just make endless choices basically from this.
They tried to tell me that infinity was an imaginary number.
Not anymore.
Not when you're using Twine. So say I want this choice or no, this choice. So, and also, so if you want something to not show up, you can do this. Oh gosh, I have not used Twine extensively.
But it's so nice to people that don't know how to do anything related to programming because it tells you how to do things all the time, and I love it dearly.
Yes.
I love being given instructions.
It is plain old parentheses. Yeah.
Yay!
There we go. That is backwards.
Uh-oh. Oh yeah. Oops.
Oh dear.
It's fine.
No, it is not fine.
Yes, it is. Totally fine. I see no flaws.
I am totally prepared.
Yay! Woohoo!
Yeah. So now you have named the passage choice. But the player will see area 1. So if you're having them choose, oh, do I want to choose, what do I want to choose? Do I want to choose like this area or that area? Maybe big letter choice means, okay, this is the right choice type of thing. And you'll have them do that. So that's just basically how you do that. Now I'm going to pull up my 281 story that I made. And this was my 281. It was a lot. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. So
This is so much.
We've got it right. What do you expect?
So basically, you can also make things like health systems within Twine. So basically, I made kind of a health system where if you get caught, depending on what variable things are set to, you will go to like any of these different encounters. And yeah, and basically, if you get caught, I believe it was 5 times after a certain point, basically, you will die. You're done for. So you could also use variables to do things such as make inventories and health systems entwine. So it's pretty fun and also dying.
Went extinct.
And it died. The presentation died too. It was its 5th encounter.
Yeah, it's been struggling. Okay, it is back now. It decided to be all right. And it is back with us. Wonderful.
Yeah,
At
just
the
to
end.
note that for the programming-oriented people in this room, the programming is very powerful. You can make combat systems if you have even a loose understanding of state machines. So you can really do whole games in this.
Yeah.
This is a programming question, but is Twine Turing complete?
Yes.
Yeah.
The fuck?
You can't ask us that.
This, yeah. This is the extent of my programming. So, but yeah. And I'm
Gee, my goat.
Do you want to run a game and demonstrate what that looks like?
I think it's fine.
yeah. I'm going to take out these parentheses and then I will put this in the Discord and y'all can go and twine it up.
Write a story. Woo!
Write a story. Make people make
Be
choices.
poetic with your choices.
Yes.
Yes. I want to see dilemmas. I want to see death. Yes.
Desolation.
Yes. Correct.
That.
You're the second winner of the presentation.